Let me just say that during a televised bipartisan meeting recently in the White House, the President suggested that we might be more collegial around here and more efficient in Congress if we would just bring back earmarks. The reaction from lawmakers present was decidedly mixed. Some cheered that declaration, but most of us, I have to say, recoiled at the thought. As someone who served in Congress during the gluttonous earmark era, when pork was used regularly to buy and sell congressmen's votes, I can tell you firsthand, this is an idea that nobody ought to be laughing at or embracing. Amidst public corruption investigations and a constant stream of embarrassing headlines about sweetheart deals for family and friends, Congress was forced to place a moratorium on earmarks about 7 or 8 years ago. Earmarking does not improve the legislative process. In fact, it compromises members into ignoring unethical behavior and voting for bad bills that they would otherwise oppose. Remember, Obamacare was approved when a single vote was secured with an earmark, the one that was derided as the Cornhusker kickback. Likewise, when senators receive earmarks, they are agreeing in return to support hundreds of other earmarks stuffed into an appropriation bill. Let me just talk about when people say that the appropriations process would be a lot smoother, work a lot better with earmarks. There was about a period of 10 years where earmarks really hit the high point. 1994 or 95 through 2006. I served in the House from 2001 to 2012. And during that time, we had earmarks for part of the time and went without earmarks part of the time. 2005, I think everybody recognizes, was the high point, or the low point, if you want to put it that way. There were a total of 16,000 earmarks spread across 12 appropriation bills and 1 authorization bill, worth about $30 billion. Now, you would think that if you had that much to grease the skids in Washington, that we should have been able to pass all appropriation measures and move through the process. We'd have a more collegial, compliant body. During that time, in 2005, I just checked, we passed only 5 appropriation bills in the House. Only 5. We ended up with an omnibus bill. And that was when Republicans controlled the House, the Senate, and the White House. So this notion that we've got to have earmarks, and if we just get back to earmarks, then this place will run smoothly, we'll get through the appropriation bills. 16,000 earmarks, worth about $30 billion, only 5 appropriation bills approved. We all remember too well the indoor rainforest in Iowa, the Teapot Museum in North Carolina, and of course the bridge to nowhere in Alaska. When a challenge was made to that infamous bridge and other pork projects, not-so-veiled threats were leveled at senators and members of Congress who dared question their colleagues' pork project. So we simply cannot go back to that time. I remember well, during that time, one particular episode, we were in HC5, the House basement. It was during the appropriation season, and all of a sudden one member ran into the room, just breathless. He had the list from the Appropriations Committee as to who was getting the earmarks and who wasn't. That was largely a staff-driven process, but then everybody the thing was, we've got to get these earmarks, we've got to go announce them quickly in the House before the senators take credit for them. That was the atmosphere at that time. That was not a high point. That's not something that we want to return to. I was looking at some of what I said in the House at that time and some of what I quoted when we were trying to get rid of them in 2009. I quoted at that time, The Hill newspaper reported that a prominent lobbying firm founded by the subject of a federal was the subject of a federal investigation into potentially corrupt political contributions. It had given $3.4 million in political contributions to no less than 284 members of Congress. There were lobbying shops that set up for that purpose, simply to be at the intersection of earmarks and policy. The Hill also reported on February 10th, 2009, that this firm, which specialized in, quote, obtaining earmarks in the defense budget for a long list of clients, was, quote, recently raided by the FBI. The New York Times noted that the same lobbyist for that firm, quote, set up shop at the busy intersection between political fundraising and taxpayer spending, directing tens of millions of dollars in contributions to lawmakers while steering hundreds of millions of dollars in earmark contracts back to his clients. This is a process that simply is too tough to police when it gets this way. During my time in the House, over a series of a number of years, I went to the House floor literally hundreds of times to challenge individual earmarks in these spending projects. For those who think that you can go and challenge these earmarks and have somebody say, all right, yeah, I didn't want to spend money on that Teapot Museum anyway, that's a bad idea. That rarely happened. In the hundreds of times I went to the floor to challenge earmark spending, there was only one vote that I won. Only one in hundreds of times, because the process of log rolling takes over, where one member will say, I'll protect your earmark if you protect mine. It was more likely that I would get 30, 40, 50 votes. If I was challenging a popular appropriator, I would get even fewer, because nobody wanted to challenge them because their own earmarks would be threatened. This is not a process that we want to go back to. This is not something that we should be proud of in our history. Several of our colleagues ended up in jail. One of them actually had an earmark bribe menu printed in hand on his congressional letterhead, where you want an earmark for this much, here's what it'll cost you, under the table. He ended up doing time in prison. Not every member did that, obviously. But it's a process that is too difficult to control. And here's the worst part about earmarks, generally. Some will say that it's just a fraction of spending. It's just a couple of percentage points off the federal budget, which is true. But the problem is, once you get back into earmarking, the Appropriations Committee spends an inordinate amount of time, the majority of its time, focusing on that 1 or 2 percentage points of the funding, and gives up its oversight responsibilities on the other 98% of the budget. And we simply don't do the oversight that we should be doing on the federal agencies and how they spend this money. That's the worst part of earmarking, that we simply give up oversight. Yeah, we pay a lot of attention to that 1 or 2% of funding, but we give up oversight on the rest effectively. So I hope we don't go there. That's why I'm introducing bipartisan legislation, joined by my colleague from Utah, to ban permanently all congressional earmarking. Senators McCaskill, Toomey, McCain, Lee, Portman, Johnson, Rubio, Ernst, Fisher, and Sass are all on as co-sponsors. And I hope that when this is brought to the floor that it passes and we don't go back to this practice of earmarking. And I would turn back to my colleague from Utah and see what other thoughts he has on the subject. One of the things I fear most is we're having a tough enough time controlling spending. Dr. Coburn, who served in the House, I admired his time there. He went after earmarks and after a lot of these appropriations and did the same thing when he came to the Senate until the last day he was here. But he had a saying, he said, earmarks are